The United Kingdom has been thrown into a storm of uncertainty and alarm after breaking news revealed that the nation's top judge has urgently summoned King Charles III for a private emergency meeting. This is not routine protocol. This is not a ceremonial update. This is a direct, behind-closed-doors intervention at the highest constitutional level, one that signals a crisis too severe to be ignored. The timing could not be more explosive. Prime Minister Keir Starmer is just days away from sitting down with top EU leaders in what is being framed as a historic UK-EU summit. But beneath the public smiles and diplomatic pleasantries, the reality is far more dangerous. This meeting between the judge and the monarch is no ordinary consultation. It is a desperate attempt to sound the alarm before irreversible damage is done to Britain's sovereignty. And at the centre of it all is Starmer's quiet, calculated push to draw the United Kingdom back under Brussels' control, piece by piece, without the consent of the British people. For years, the promise of Brexit was simple. Take back control. Control over borders, over laws, over Britain's destiny. That promise carried the weight of millions of votes, a once-in-a-generation decision to break free from decades of EU dominance. But now, just a few years later, that hard-won sovereignty hangs by a thread. Whispers from Whitehall suggest that Starmer's government has been working behind the scenes on a set of agreements that would reverse key pillars of Brexit without ever asking the public for permission. And the involvement of the UK's highest judicial authority, seeking a direct audience with the King, shows just how dangerous these moves are considered to be by those who understand the constitutional framework better than anyone. The most alarming of Starmer's plans is his willingness to restore the European Court of Justice's authority over UK-EU disputes. The ECJ, the very court Britain fought to escape, is now poised to regain its final say over British legal matters if these deals go through. This would be nothing short of a constitutional U-turn, handing legal supremacy back to Brussels in a move that shreds the principle of parliamentary sovereignty. Legal experts and political analysts alike warn that this is not merely a technical adjustment, it is the first step in dismantling the core achievement of Brexit. It risks re-establishing a two-tier legal system in which domestic courts are forced to bow to rulings made outside British soil. But Starmer's ambitions don't end with the courts. Another element of his plan is the so-called youth mobility scheme, a policy being sold to the public as an opportunity for cultural exchange and work experience. In truth, critics fear it will reopen Britain's borders to a new wave of EU migration under the pretext of temporary work and study visas. Once in place, such a scheme could be quietly expanded, becoming a backdoor to the kind of free movement that Brexit voters decisively rejected in 2016. For many, this is a betrayal wrapped in diplomatic packaging, presented as harmless, even beneficial, while carrying enormous long-term consequences for border control and immigration policy. The defence sphere is yet another pressure point. Defence Secretary John Healey has already signalled Britain's readiness to pour taxpayer money into EU-led defence initiatives. On paper, this sounds like cooperative security. In reality, it opens the door to shared strategic planning, intelligence pooling, and military resource integration under Brussels' direction. This means Britain could find its armed forces increasingly operating within EU chains of command, undermining the independence of the UK military and limiting the nation's ability to act unilaterally in times of crisis. For a country that prides itself on its military autonomy, this is a red flag that cannot be ignored. The judge's intervention is unprecedented. The monarch's role is supposed to be politically neutral, yet the decision to involve King Charles shows that constitutional lines are being tested in ways not seen for decades. It is not about the king making political choices. He cannot. It is about signalling the seriousness of what is unfolding and making sure every possible safeguard is considered before Starmer crosses a point of no return. Reports from palace insiders suggest a mood of deep unease, with fears that once these agreements are signed, it will be far harder, perhaps impossible, to claw back the powers Britain is about to give away. And all of this is building toward May 19th. When Starmer will meet face-to-face with EU heavyweights like Ursula von der Leyen and Antonio Costa. The official narrative will be one of strengthened partnerships and practical cooperation. But the reality, as feared by those closest to the crisis, is a slow-motion surrender disguised as progress. Each handshake, each signed document, will chip away at Britain's independence, leaving the public none the wiser until the consequences are too entrenched to reverse. This is not simply a political disagreement. It is a constitutional showdown. The judge's move to involve the king is the loudest warning yet that the nation is being led down a dangerous path, one that could undo the democratic decision of millions and pull Britain back under the EU's shadow. The question now is whether this alarm will be heard and acted upon, or whether history will record this moment as the point where sovereignty slipped quietly away, behind the closed doors of power. As the political tension escalates, the secrecy surrounding Starmer's manoeuvres has become one of the most troubling aspects of this unfolding crisis. The very foundations of Britain's democracy rely on transparency, accountability, and the consent of the governed. Yet these high-stakes decisions are being shaped in closed meeting rooms, without parliamentary debate, public consultation, or open scrutiny. This deliberate lack of openness is not accidental. It is strategic. By keeping the details under wraps until the agreements are signed, Starmer can present them as fait accompli, leaving opponents with little room to challenge or reverse them. It is a tactic that undermines the parliamentary process and silences the voice of the electorate. The reinstatement of the European Court of Justice's authority is not a minor adjustment. It is a direct breach of the promise that Brexit would return judicial sovereignty to Britain. Before 2016, the ECJ's reach extended into almost every sphere of UK law, from trade disputes to immigration rulings. It was precisely this loss of judicial independence that fueled the Brexit movement. Now, under Starmer's leadership, Britain stands on the verge of undoing that separation, effectively binding the nation once again to foreign judicial oversight. Such a move is not only politically explosive, but constitutionally destabilising, as it strikes at the very principle that no outside body should have the power to overrule the decisions of British courts or Parliament. Equally contentious is the proposed youth mobility scheme, which Starmer's government has marketed as a harmless way to connect Britain's young generation with opportunities in Europe. The reality, as critics point out, is that this scheme could open the door to mass migration flows under a friendly-sounding label. By allowing thousands of young Europeans to work and study freely in the UK, the scheme could mirror aspects of the pre-Brexit free movement system. And once such a policy is in place, history shows it is extremely difficult to reverse, especially when powerful business lobbies, academic institutions, and political allies stand to benefit from an expanded EU Labour presence in Britain. For communities that have already expressed deep concerns about immigration, pressures on housing, jobs, and public services, this could be the breaking point. On the defence front, Britain's involvement in EU military programmes presents risks that go far beyond budgetary contributions. The commitments outlined by John Healey could see Britain sharing sensitive intelligence, pooling military assets, and even aligning operational decisions with EU command structures. This is more than cooperation, it is integration. And integration in defence is not easily untangled. Once chains of command, joint planning mechanisms, and shared resources are embedded, reversing them becomes a logistical and diplomatic nightmare. It is precisely this kind of entanglement that many Brexit supporters warned against, a slow erosion of independent capability in exchange for political alignment with Brussels. The constitutional ramifications are severe. Britain's unwritten constitution depends on the balance of powers between Parliament, the judiciary, and the Crown. When the judiciary feels compelled to involve the monarch in an urgent consultation, it means that this balance is being disrupted. King Charles III may not be able to intervene directly, but his symbolic position as the guardian of the Constitution carries weight. His very presence in such discussions sends a signal, one that Starmer's government cannot easily dismiss, that the course being pursued may run contrary to the nation's foundational principles. The fact that this crisis is playing out in the shadows makes it even more dangerous. The public remains largely unaware of the scale and implications of these plans, distracted by political theatre and carefully managed press briefings. Meanwhile, decisions are being prepared that could bind Britain to legal, economic, and military commitments for decades to come. Once formalised at the May 19th summit, reversing them would require not only political will, but an immense legal and diplomatic effort, one that may be beyond the capacity of any future government. This is why the judges' meeting with the King is so significant. It is not merely a procedural formality, it is a constitutional alarm bell ringing at full volume. The involvement of the monarchy underscores that this is not simply another chapter in Britain's political debates. It is a defining moment in the nation's post-Brexit history, one that could either reaffirm the sovereignty millions voted for or quietly surrender it to the very structures they chose to leave. The days ahead will determine which path Britain takes, but for now, the storm clouds are gathering over Westminster, and the stakes could not be higher. The closer Britain moves toward the May 19th summit, the clearer it becomes that this is not an isolated policy debate. It is the convergence of multiple, interconnected threats to the foundations of national sovereignty. At the heart of this crisis is the creeping reality of political reintegration with the European Union, not through an open referendum or a public mandate, but through incremental legal, economic, and military concessions that most citizens will only recognise after the damage is done. Keir Starmer's strategy is being described by insiders as one of quiet normalisation, where Britain's post-Brexit policies are gradually reshaped to mirror those of its former EU membership. By the time the public realises the extent of the shift, the agreements will be too embedded to reverse without severe disruption. The European Court of Justice issue exemplifies this tactic. Officially, Starmer frames the acceptance of ECJ oversight as a necessary compromise to ensure smoother trade and dispute resolution with EU partners. But history shows that once the ECJ has jurisdiction, its influence expands far beyond the initial scope of the agreement. In the pre-Brexit years, its rulings shaped domestic policies on employment law, environmental regulations, immigration, and commercial disputes. Allowing its jurisdiction to return, no matter how narrowly defined at the outset, is effectively reopening the legal gates Britain fought so hard to close. The symbolism alone sends a message to Brussels. Britain is willing to bend its laws to fit EU rules once again. Similarly, the youth mobility scheme is being sold under the language of opportunity and cultural exchange, but the structural implications are far more significant. By giving young Europeans a streamlined route into Britain for work and study, the government risks reintroducing population flows on a scale that could once again strain housing, infrastructure, and public services. Advocates will argue this is beneficial for the economy, but for communities already facing shortages in jobs, housing, and healthcare access, the perception will be one of betrayal. It is not just about numbers. It is about the reversal of a political promise that was central to the Brexit campaign. The ability for Britain to control its own immigration policies without external pressure. The defence integration proposals deepen the concern. Britain has long prided itself on a military strategy shaped entirely by its own national interests. From Falklands-era independence to modern counter-terrorism operations, control over armed forces has been a cornerstone of national identity. Yet the agreements being prepared for EU defence cooperation risk placing parts of that command structure under shared control. Joint planning exercises, pooled resources, and integrated intelligence systems may appear efficient in peacetime, but could compromise Britain's ability to act swiftly and independently in a crisis. It is one thing to consult allies, it is another to require their approval before acting. What makes this moment so alarming is the lack of public debate. The public was engaged and energised during the Brexit years, because they were told their voice mattered in shaping Britain's future. Now, decisions with potentially greater long-term impact are being finalised without meaningful public input. Starmer's government insists that these moves are about partnership and pragmatism, but critics see them as deliberate attempts to bypass the electorate. Once signed at the summit, the agreements will gain international legal standing, making them difficult to challenge without risking diplomatic and economic backlash. This explains why the top judge's intervention is so extraordinary. The judiciary rarely enters the political arena in such a visible way, and involving the monarch is an even rarer step. In the unwritten British Constitution, the Crown exists as a stabilising force, above partisan politics, safeguarding the continuity of the state. When a judge seeks a private audience with the King, it suggests a perception that the constitutional balance itself is at risk. While the King cannot dictate policy, he can raise concerns and act as a moral compass for the nation. His engagement in this matter is a warning shot to those in power that they are treading dangerously close to a constitutional breach. Every element of this crisis, the ECJ's return, the youth mobility scheme, the defence integration, represents a deliberate narrowing of the gap between Britain and Brussels. Taken individually, each policy could be defended as a pragmatic choice. Taken together, they form a pattern too obvious to ignore. The slow, calculated undoing of Brexit under the radar of public scrutiny. If this pattern continues unchecked, Britain could find itself locked into a hybrid status, neither fully inside the EU nor truly independent, bound by obligations that carry all the constraints of membership without the voice or vote at the table. The nation now stands at a pivotal moment. In the coming days, the outcome of this constitutional confrontation will become clearer, and Britain will either reaffirm the sovereignty it fought to regain or surrender it quietly in a series of diplomatic signatures. The public, for now, remains largely unaware of how close that choice already is to being made. The significance of this crisis extends far beyond the immediate political landscape. It strikes at the heart of Britain's identity, its democratic principles, and the trust between the government and the people. The 2016 referendum was not just a policy decision. It was a national turning point, a moment when the electorate exercised its power to chart an independent course. That decision came with the expectation that the government, regardless of party, would uphold the mandate. Yet today, many feel that expectation is being quietly betrayed. By negotiating agreements that edge Britain back into the EU's sphere of influence without a fresh mandate, Keir Starmer's government risks not only political backlash, but a profound erosion of public faith in the democratic process itself. This erosion is already visible in the shifting political tides. Recent local elections showed Labour losing ground in areas where Brexit sentiment runs deep, with Reform UK capitalising on the perception that traditional parties are no longer willing to defend national sovereignty. If Starmer continues down this path, he may well find himself presiding over a fractured Labour base, losing the trust of both Eurosceptic voters and members within his own ranks. Internal dissent could grow louder, especially among MPs who fear the electoral consequences of being seen as complicit in reversing Brexit by stealth. This internal instability could become another front in the crisis, making governance even more volatile. Public opinion, though largely uninformed of the specific details at present, can shift rapidly once the implications of these agreements become clear. The return of ECJ authority, for example, is not an abstract legal matter. It will have tangible effects on British law, potentially altering court rulings and legislative priorities in ways that serve EU interests over domestic priorities. The youth mobility scheme, too, could provoke sharp backlash if it leads to visible increases in migration at a time when public services and infrastructure are already under strain. Defence integration, while less visible to the everyday citizen, touches on deeply held values about Britain's ability to defend itself without external control. The top judge's decision to involve King Charles III is a signal that these dangers cannot be dismissed as partisan politics. It is a reminder that constitutional safeguards exist for a reason, to ensure that no government can unilaterally undermine the structural independence of the state. The monarch's role here is not to choose sides, but to serve as a witness and guardian of constitutional integrity, ensuring that the balance between branches of power is not irreversibly skewed. Even without direct intervention, the symbolic weight of the King's involvement sends a message to the public. What is unfolding is not business as usual. The coming summit on May 19th is now more than a diplomatic engagement. It is a defining moment in Britain's post-Brexit history. What Starmer agrees to in those rooms with EU leaders will shape the nation's legal framework, its immigration policy, and its defence commitments for years, possibly decades. And if these commitments are made without public consent, they will carry the stain of illegitimacy, no matter how they are spun in official statements. History shows that when the public feels shut out of decisions that reshape the nation's future, political consequences are swift and severe. The urgency for public awareness cannot be overstated. Once these agreements are formalised, reversing them would require a monumental political effort, potentially involving fresh referendums, prolonged legal disputes, and diplomatic confrontations with Brussels. That is why the present moment is so critical. The window for meaningful resistance is narrow, and the decisions made in the next few days will either uphold or undermine the sovereignty that Brexit was meant to secure. The judge's private meeting with the King will not, by itself, stop Starmer's plans, but it has pierced the wall of secrecy, drawing attention to the fact that something unprecedented and potentially irreversible is taking place. It is now up to Parliament, political opposition, the media, and most importantly, the British public to decide whether to accept these changes quietly or to demand that their voices be heard before the country is bound by new obligations to Brussels. This is the test of Britain's democratic resilience. Will the will of the people prevail, as it did in 2016, or will it be eroded by backroom diplomacy and political calculation? The answer will define not only the future of Brexit, but the credibility of the democratic process itself. And as the clock ticks toward May 19th, one truth becomes impossible to ignore. Britain stands on the edge of a decision that will shape its destiny for generations.